The sky was the color of steel wool. Over the North Sea, 20,000 feet up, B-24 Liberators droned eastward in formation, invisible to one another in a rolling ocean of cloud. The vapor was so thick that wings vanished within seconds. Each crew flew inside a private storm of noise, vibration, and blind faith. In the lead ship, the radar operator leaned over a glowing screen, a circular scope humming softly, its green phosphor flickering with ghostly shapes. Rivers, cities, rail yards, not in light but in echoes. To the bombardier, his Norden bomb sight was useless. He couldn't see the ground, couldn't even see the next plane. But in his headset, a calm voice spoke. Target mark verified. River bend showing clear on Mickey. Stand by for release. Far below, in Hanover, the Luftwaffe's early warning radar screamed of incoming formations. Fighters scrambled. Bf-109s and Fw-190s clawed through cloud they couldn't penetrate. Controllers shouted headings, but no one could find the enemy. The sky was solid, deaf, featureless. Then, through the murk, thunder rolled. The earth itself shuddered. Bombs fell unseen, yet perfectly aligned. Entire factories vanished under the weight of blind precision. On the ground, German spotters waited for the bomber streams to appear. They never saw them, only the explosions. Above the clouds, the radar operator smiled faintly and switched off the scope. Mickey confirms direct hits, he said. For the first time in the air war, weather no longer mattered. What had once been a shield of cloud had become the Allies' greatest weapon, when the sky turned against the bombers. For the Allied bomber crews of 1943 and 1944, the enemy wasn't always the Luftwaffe. It was the weather. Over northern Europe, clouds were as constant as death. In winter, thick overcast covered the continent for weeks. From the Irish Sea to the Elbe, visibility rarely stretched beyond a few miles. Entire missions were scrubbed because crews couldn't see their targets. When they did fly, hundreds of aircraft often turned back. Their bombs dropped on ETA, estimates of where a city or rail yard might be under the white sheet below. For the U.S. 8th Air Force, which prided itself on precision daylight bombing, those guesses were unacceptable. By early 1944, the statistics were grim. Nearly half of all daylight raids were either aborted or ineffective due to cloud cover. Bomber losses were catastrophic, and the results were inconsistent. Factories missed, rail yards spared, whole cities bombed by accident. For months, generals argued over whether the promise of daylight accuracy was even sustainable in Europe's climate. The Germans knew this weakness too. Their intelligence summaries often noted, weather over Reich, heavy cloud, enemy activity, none. Every gray day bought the Third Reich another sunrise. The problem of visibility traditional bombing relied on the Norden bomb sight, a marvel of mechanical engineering that let bombardiers calculate wind drift, altitude, and ground speed to place bombs within a few hundred feet of a target, in clear weather. The Norden's entire genius depended on sight. It required the bombardier to identify landmarks and track them visually for calibration. When clouds intervened, that precision became fantasy. And so, through much of 1943, the Great Daylight Offensive faltered. American formations of B-17s and B-24s slogged into heavy flak and fighter resistance, only to find their targets invisible. Some dropped blind, others jettisoned to lighten their load for the return trip. On the ground, German civilians and commanders learned to pray for overcast skies. When the ceiling dropped, they relaxed. The next day's raids would likely miss. The Allied air war was being held hostage by meteorology. A new kind of sight in Britain. A different war was being fought, one of electrons and wavelengths. Scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, had already developed radar sets to detect enemy aircraft. The British bomber force, which had suffered heavy losses during night raids, had learned to navigate and bomb using radar as early as 1942 with the H2S system, a cavity magnetron-powered radar that painted ground features as fuzzy white, shapes on a cathode ray screen. When American officers in the 8th Air Force saw the system, they were skeptical. Too crude for daylight, one general called it. But after the winter of 1943 nearly paralyzed operations, they reconsidered. Thus began the H2X program, the American version of the British H2S, improved with higher frequency X-band waves that gave better resolution. The crews called it Mickey because its glowing circular scope reminded them of Mickey Mouse's face. The name stuck, casual and almost comic for a machine that would change the war. The Mickey ship. The first Mickey ships were B-17s and B-24s modified to carry the H2X radar dome, a plexiglass blister replacing the ball turret under the fuselage. Inside, a radar operator sat before the glowing scope, reading echoes of rivers, coastlines, and cities. What he saw were not pictures, but patterns. Bright blobs for dense structures, dark streaks for water. Bridges appeared as thin lines, factory districts as smudged ovals. It took months of training for operators to interpret what they saw. In formation, the Mickey ship flew lead. When the operator identified the target on the screen, he gave the word to the bombardier, who released on command. Every other bomber in the formation toggled their payload simultaneously. Instead of hundreds of independent guesses, a single radar return now guided an entire wing. It was a revolution hidden inside a 10-inch glass tube. The Germans watched the clouds. Close. For the Luftwaffe, the overcast had always been their ally. It limited Allied visibility and gave interceptors an edge. They could use the Freya and Würzburg radar networks to direct fighters above the cloud layer, then dive into formations caught between heaven and earth. But H2X changed that geometry. Now the bombers could strike without ever descending below the weather, and the German fighters, forced to climb through blind cloud, lost both their altitude advantage and their timing. German controllers complained bitterly. Enemy formations no longer depend on visibility. They come when we cannot find them. By late 1944, clouds no longer protected the Reich. The Americans had learned to see through them, and the radar blips blooming on the scopes in those lead ships, soft green ghosts, were about to make every weather forecast meaningless. Inside the eye that saw through cloud, the H2X Mickey radar was the product of science catching up to desperation. Its origins lay in a small metal tube, the cavity magnetron, first perfected by British physicists John Randall and Harry Boot in 1940. That device, no larger than a teacup, could generate microwave frequencies powerful enough to pierce weather and reflect from the ground. Before it, radar worked on long wavelengths that blurred details. A city and a forest might look the same. With the magnetron, radar vision sharpened until rivers, bridges, and coastlines emerged as distinct shapes. The British called their bomber radar H2S, after Home Sweet Home, because its first purpose was to bring night bombers back across the North Sea. But its potential as a bombing aid was obvious. Early sets painted towns as bright blooms of static, helping crews find large cities even through fog. The Americans, committed to precision, saw a chance to turn that ghostly outline into a weapon of accuracy. Building the H2X in 1943, engineers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Radiation Laboratory received a shipment of British magnetrons under the top-secret Tizard Mission Exchange. Within months, they were modifying the design for U.S. bombers. The result was the AN-APS-15, nicknamed H2X, operating at 3 centimeters wavelength, short enough to map cities, long enough to remain stable in turbulence. Physically, the system replaced the ball turret under the bomber's belly with a plexiglass radome housing a dish antenna that scanned in a 360-degree sweep. Inside, a radar operator, often the most technically trained man aboard, sat hunched before a circular scope. Each sweep painted the ground below in shades of brightness. Rivers showed as black scars, towns as pale patches, coastlines as sinuous arcs. To the untrained eye, it looked like nonsense. To the experienced operator, it was a map more reliable than any chart in cloud or darkness. Learning to read shadows. The training pipeline for Mickey operators was short and intense. At bases in England and later in France, radar schools taught recognition through repetition. Hundreds of photographic prints taken from radar scopes, each labeled with the corresponding target area. Operators memorized them like navigators memorizing coastlines. They learned that industrial areas glowed brighter due to metallic roofs, that forests absorbed microwaves, that water always appeared black. The trick was to correlate those tones with maps and bomb-run geometry. When an operator announced, "Mickey showing Riverbend, steady on," he was translating electrons into geography, guessing a target's center from echoes arriving at the speed of light. He had seconds to make the call. In that moment, the entire formation trusted his judgment. Dozens of bombers, thousands of bombs, all dropped on a ghost image the enemy could neither see nor block. Integrating radar into crews changed cockpit dynamics. The bombardier, once the focal point of precision, now shared his authority. In thick weather, the Mickey operator effectively became the eyes of the aircraft. Pilots learned to rely on his instructions more than on the flight leader's visual signals. Over the interphone, conversations took on a new rhythm. Bombardier to radar. Target in view. Affirmative. River and rail yard aligned. Recommend release at 15 seconds. At that call, the bombardier toggled the switch, trusting the green scope as if it were daylight, countermeasures, and the invisible duel. The Germans were not blind to the change. Radio intercept units detected the microwave pulses of the H2X and labeled them Rotterdam Gerat, assuming the signal came from ground-based transmitters. The Luftwaffe scrambled to jam it with noise from radar stations, but the frequency was too high, the pulses too short. Standard jammers like Kettenhund and Flammenwerfer were useless. The only theoretical countermeasure was smoke, and smoke could not rise high enough to matter. Intercept pilots, guided by their own ground radar, climbed into clouds that hid the bombers completely. They burst through overcast into the formation too late, often attacking only after bombs had already fallen. The sky had become a layered battlefield. Radar above, radar below, eyes nowhere. When technology and weather became allies, by late 1944, the 8th Air Force operated dozens of H2X-equipped leads across its bomber groups. Missions that would once have been scrubbed for weather now launched routinely. The daily forecasts that used to dictate life or death. Ceiling below 10,000. Visibility nil. No longer carried the same weight. For the first time, the Allies could plan an air campaign independent of sunlight or cloud. The irony was exquisite. Europe's endless gray had been Germany's shield, and now it became America's ally. The very climate that once grounded aircraft now masked their approach and precision alike. In the ready rooms of the Luftwaffe, meteorological briefings grew grim. A colonel reportedly muttered, "It is no longer weather that saves us, only exhaustion." The next chapter of the air war would prove him right, because when H2X reached full operational maturity in early 1945, the bombers no longer needed to see their targets, only to trust the green light of a cathode ray and the invisible reflections of a radar pulse. The men who learned to see in the dark. No weapon, no radar, no strategy ever fights alone. It is always a man, half trained, half terrified, sitting at a glowing screen, deciding when to speak. The story of H2X is not only about electrons and magnetrons. It is about the humans who turned them into sight. The radar men, they were not pilots, not gunners, not bombardiers. They were observers, hunched figures in dimly lit compartments deep in the fuselage, their faces washed in eerie green. The radar operator's world was circular, framed by a scope the size of a dinner plate. The rest of the war existed as sound: engine roar, interphone chatter, the hiss of oxygen masks. Each sweep of the scope revealed a living geography made of ghosts. On a clear night, the return from a coastline appeared as a perfect crescent. On a cloudy one, the entire world shimmered in static. The operator's task was to find pattern inside noise. They learned to read the echoes like fingerprints. The twin rivers of Frankfurt, the bright patch of Hamburg's docks, the broken grid of Cologne. At 20,000 feet, they were tracing the Earth by its reflections. It's like flying over the moon," one Mickey operator wrote in his log. "Everything below you is invisible, yet the screen shows it breathing." These men rarely saw combat the way gunners did, but their responsibility was crushing. One wrong interpretation, one mistaken bend in a river, could send an entire bomber group's bombs drifting into empty farmland, or worse, into civilian housing miles away. Trust and blindness in a normal bombing run. The crew relied on the bombardier's eyes. But with H2X, the entire formation depended on a single human judgment filtered through technology. Crews called it bombing by faith. Pilots, used to flying in formation by sight, now followed instruments through clouds thick enough to erase the wingtips beside them. There was no horizon, no visual reference, just the compass and the voice of the Mickey ship. "We don't see the target anymore," one pilot recalled. "We see belief. We drop on a voice." To the Germans, that faith seemed mechanical, inhuman. They imagined the Americans as robots, following radar blips without emotion. But for the men inside those liberators, every decision was personal. Each pulse on the scope meant hundreds of lives, both above and below. The other side of the clouds, for the Luftwaffe pilots climbing to intercept, the sky had become a blind maze. Controllers on the ground gave headings, altitudes, and bearings, their voices urgent over the radio. Feindwehrband 10 Kilometer westlich. Steigt jetzt. Enemy formation 10 kilometers west. Climb now. The fighters broke through one layer of cloud, then another. Ice rimed their canopies. Needles danced on frozen gauges. When they emerged into sunlight, the bombers were gone. Hidden above or below, impossible to see. The German pilots began to hate the clouds. Once, overcast had been their ally. Now it was a traitor. It hid the enemy and revealed nothing. Many turned back before reaching the combat zone, their fuel dwindling, their nerves shredded by the disorientation of blind flight. "I could hear them," one Bf-109 pilot wrote later. "I could hear the engines of the bombers in the clouds, but there was nothing to shoot at. Just thunder and echoes." Inside the lead liberator, the radar operator's breathing was slow, deliberate. Every 30 seconds, he wiped condensation from the plexiglass dome with a rag attached to a stick. Static crackled through his headset. The bombardier sat above him, gloved hands resting on the release toggle. The interphone hissed. "Mickey, confirm target." "Stand by. Signal brightening. River Junction confirmed. Target 1 mile ahead. Hold course." He adjusted the range ring, fine-tuned the gain knob, and waited for the return pulse to strengthen. The green line on the screen thickened, then bloomed into a solid shape. Target in scope. Drop in 5, 4, 3. Somewhere above the clouds, hundreds of bomb bay doors opened in perfect synchrony. The operator felt the vibration as 5,000 pounds of bombs fell free. The scope flickered as shock waves from their detonation rippled through the air, visible as brief bursts of light across the screen. He logged the time. H2X release, 10:36 a.m. Then he sat back, exhausted, his heart racing though the mission had seemed quiet. Clouds as a new kind of battlefield above. The B-24s reformed into columns invisible even to each other. Below, the clouds churned with black flak bursts that never reached them. Between those two layers and between blindness and destruction was the space where the radar men lived. They had turned weather into cover, invisibility into advantage. The Germans had built fortresses of concrete and steel. The Americans had built one of cloud and signal. The men who stared into those glowing circles didn't know it, but they were pioneering the future of warfare, a future where battle would be guided not by eyes but by screens, where victory would come not from what could be seen but from what could be measured. The next part of their story unfolds at the intersection of machine and human, the moment when faith in the radar became doctrine, and the Allies began designing entire missions around invisible targets. Machines, maps, and the logic of blind bombing. H2X was less a single device than a new way of thinking. It fused physics and procedure, a magnetron that turned air into a mirror, an antenna that swept that mirror like a lighthouse, and crews who learned to read the echoes. From those pieces came a doctrine, navigation and bombing by reflection, that dissolved the old rules of visibility. How the eye worked at the heart of H2X was the microwave magnetron, a tiny, furious furnace of oscillating electrons. It threw out pulses at centimeter wavelengths that struck the ground and returned as echoes. The radar dish in the radome spun or scanned, sending a steady radial sweep to the cathode ray tube in the operator's cabin. The display was not a picture but a code of intensity. Bright returns meant metal and masonry. Dark meant water or open ground. The operator learned to translate brightness into geography. A railway yard became a fuzzy white rectangle. A river, a long black vein. Resolution mattered. H2X's shorter wavelength than earlier radars produced finer detail. It could distinguish an industrial cluster from surrounding suburb. That capability let crews identify target types, rail yards, docks, factories, rather than relying on landmarks alone. It didn't create a photograph. It created a working map you could drop bombs on blind. Formation as instrument. The Mickey ship was the formation's brain. One radar return, one decision, and dozens of bomb bays opened together. This required discipline. Timing, airspeed, and altitude had to be maintained to the second. The lead navigator became the group's metronome. His radar operator, the eye, bombardiers and wing ships armed and stood ready, trusting the lead's call to release. Navigation systems were paired to make that trust possible. Dead reckoning was augmented by G-lines and by long-range radio beacons. Pathfinders, specially chosen crews, practiced flight profiles until they could hold a track through turbulence and skeletal cloud. At the point of attack, the Mickey operator took over. He locked the formation to the ground pattern on. This was not improvisation. It was choreography. The whole tactic reduced weather from a random variable into another parameter to be measured and compensated for. Countermeasures. The invisible duel. The Germans reacted predictably and innovatively. They hunted the new site as they had hunted every Allied advance, with receivers, jammers, and deception. Signals intelligence units listened for the telltale microwave pulses and tried to locate their sources. Anti-radar efforts attempted noise jamming, and night fighters used ground-controlled vectors to climb into cloud banks and hope for brief visual contact. But H2X presented problems jammers were ill-equipped to solve. Its pulses were short and at high frequency. Ground-based jammers had limited effect without massive transmitter power and precise tuning. Worse for defenders, cloud itself limited the usefulness of passive spotting. Smoke screens could mask a yard for visual observers, but not the radar. Returns that came from metal roofs and train. Marshalling yards. German. Scientists did develop receivers to try to home on. Allied radar emissions, devices, that could tell them roughly where microwave energy originated, and units sometimes enjoyed limited success. But these solutions were patchy, often late, and easily outpaced by changes in Allied tactics. The radar duel became one of attrition. Each side raised a technical counter, the other adapted, and missions became a contest of speed and guesswork as much as electronics. The tyranny of timing H2X taught planners a bitter truth. Precision in weather demanded timing. The whole strike's success could hinge on a single operator's call. If formation timing slipped, the bombs might cascade into empty fields or, worse, into populated areas. That risk forced intense rehearsal, rendezvous points, set airspeeds, and precise altitude corridors. The Mickey ship's operator was trained not only as a technician but as a conductor, synchronizing dozens of human and mechanical instruments into one release. Training was relentless. Radar schools fed operators stacks of annotated scope photographs until recognition became reflex. Crews flew practice runs over mapped areas, comparing scope images with known terrain until the job felt less like guessing and more like reading a clock. From tactic to strategy, the tactical success of H2X rippled upward. If cloud no longer halted a raid, planners could schedule missions at will, irrespective of weather windows. That changed the strategic tempo of the air war. Daylight operations became a continuous pressure that German industry and transport could not easily escape. The bomber force, once constrained by seasons and skies, now imposed a relentless rhythm on the Reich, and that rhythm had consequences beyond immediate destruction. It forced the Luftwaffe into costly, disorienting climbs and imperfect interceptions. It compelled the Germans to divert resources to electronic warfare and to alter dispersal and camouflage practices across factories and yards. H2X had not only pierced cloud, it had punctured the assumption that nature would shield industry and infrastructure. H2X turned the sky itself into an instrument of war. A scanned, measured volume in which sight was no longer the privilege of eyes but the province of pulses and phosphor. The next chapter shows that instrument in action at scale. The massive, weather-blinded raids of early 1945, where Mickey guided hundreds of bombers to targets the Germans never saw until they were destroyed. The day the clouds stopped helping Germany. Magdeburg, January 1945. Dawn came as a gray lid over central Germany. At the forward bases in East Anglia, B-24 Liberators of the 8th Air Force stood wingtip to wingtip under drizzle. The forecast: ceiling 0, visibility 1 mile, icing above 12,000 feet. The kind of day that once guaranteed a stand-down. But this morning the order boards read Mission Natur 802, Magdeburg, primary by Mickey. Crews filed out muttering. No one expected to see anything until they were over the target, if then. Yet for the men in the lead ships, that didn't matter. Their eyes would be made of microwaves. The ascent into blindness. Engines howled, prop wash flattening puddles. As each bomber lumbered skyward, the horizon disappeared into slate mist. Within 10 minutes, the formation was a procession of ghosts climbing by instruments alone. Inside the cockpits, condensation ran down plexiglass. Outside, nothing but white. Above 15,000 feet, contrails merged with cloud. The gunners wiped frost from their sights but saw only their own breath. The interphone crackled. Lead to group, Mickey coming online. In the lead ship's radar compartment, the operator switched on the H2X scope. The hum built to a soft whine, then a sweep of green light spun across the screen. Slowly, faint arcs appeared. The Elbe River, darker against surrounding terrain. The blotch of Magdeburg's industrial district brightening as pulses struck metal roofs. He grinned. Target acquired through solid cloud. German eyes looking up far below, at Luftflotte Reich headquarters, radar operators at Würzburg-Dora sites tracked the bomber stream. Their screens were bright with echoes, but their phones rang unanswered. Interceptor fields were socked in, runways slick with sleet. Commanders ordered climbs through blind weather anyway. At Stendal and Quedlinburg, JG-300 fighters gunned engines and vanished into fog. Some never broke out. Others emerged above the cloud deck only to find contrails stretching to the horizon. Too high, too many, unreachable. One pilot later said, "We were chasing sound. The bombers were in another world." The strike, 10:42 a.m. The lead radar operator steadied his scope. He recognized the river bend and the twin rail yards glowing on the screen's east side. He keyed the interphone, target confirmed. Hold heading 170. Release in 20 seconds. The bombardier, blind to the ground, rested his thumb on the toggle. Outside, there was only turbulence and darkness. The seconds ticked. 5, 4, 3, 2, drop. Bomb doors thundered open across hundreds of aircraft. 5,000 tons of ordnance slid into the clouds, vanishing in silence. Then, through the overcast, came a dull, sustained roar, the sound of invisible destruction. German anti-aircraft crews at Magdeburg heard it before they saw anything. The first explosions walked across the city's southern factories with mathematical spacing. Oil tanks erupted through fog like torches behind a veil. Workers who had run to shelters believing the weather would save them felt the ground lift beneath them. No siren warning had matched the precision of that fall. The moment of realization at 11 a.m., Luftwaffe Command still waited for bombing reports. Spotters reported no aircraft visible, yet plumes rose through the clouds. It took reconnaissance hours later to confirm. Entire sections of the Brabag synthetic fuel plant destroyed, bridges severed, marshalling yards crippled. The pattern was near perfect, better than many visual raids in clear sky. The after-action signal from 8th Air Force Headquarters was concise. Strike effective. Radar bombing validated under full overcast. Losses minimal. That telegram ended an era. From that day forward, weather ceased to be a sanctuary. The clouds had turned traitor. The Magdeburg raid marked a threshold, the first major operation where the Americans bombed entirely by radar and still achieved precision results. It proved that the unseen could be as deadly as daylight, when the sky betrayed its defenders. The Magdeburg raid sent more than bombs into Germany's heart. It sent panic through the command structure of a system that had believed, until that day, that weather was its ally. For years, the Luftwaffe's defensive doctrine depended on meteorology. The radar grid, Freya early warning stations feeding Würzburg-Dora tracking sets, could plot formations, but effective interception always required visual contact. Fighter control rooms could vector interceptors only so far. The final climb, the pounce, demanded eyes on target. When the sky was clear, German pilots tore through bomber boxes with lethal precision. When it was not, they waited on the ground. The clouds were their armor. Magdeburg shattered that logic. The bombers had never come into view, yet entire refineries and yards had been erased. In war diaries across central Germany, one phrase repeated, "Feind hat durch Wolken geworfen." The enemy dropped through clouds. Within 48 hours, technical officers visited the ruins. The craters were evenly spaced, factory lines precisely hit. No evidence of scatterbombing. Not random, one inspector noted. It looks as though they could see. The shock deepened when captured fragments of radar domes were recovered from wrecked liberators. Analysis by the Forschungsanstalt für Funkwesen revealed new frequencies. Microwave, far higher than any used by German radars. Their best detectors barely registered the pulses. Engineers scribbled calculations and shook their heads. "If this is real," one said, "they have built sight beyond weather." Berlin's Night Fighter Command demanded immediate countermeasures. None existed. The countermeasures that failed efforts began at once. The Electronic Warfare Division proposed broadcasting wideband noise from ground stations to overwhelm the American sets. But the power required was enormous. The microwave beams from bomber radomes were too focused, their reflections too localized. Even when jamming succeeded briefly, it blinded German radar more than it interfered with the enemy's. Another idea, metallic chaff or Doppel, already used to deceive Allied radar. Dropping it in massive quantities might create ghost returns on the Americans' screens. Experiments followed. Smoke and foil shells over Hamburg, test flights under thick overcast. But the Mickey operators reported only momentary clutter. Within minutes, automatic gain control filtered out the interference. As one German scientist put it bitterly, "We tried to make their ghosts blind. They saw through ours instead." The collapse of the interception network January turned to February 1945. Mission after mission struck rail yards, oil depots, and shipworks through unbroken cloud. Luna, Dresden, Brunswick, Hanover, all hit by formations that the Luftwaffe barely engaged. Fighter controllers complained that their stations were fighting phantoms. Interceptor squadrons launched into nothingness, wasting fuel, losing pilots to weather before ever seeing a bomber. At JG-26, the renowned Abbeville boys' morale dropped sharply. One veteran wrote, "We no longer know when they are above us. Sometimes we hear them but cannot climb high enough before they vanish. The sky no longer belongs to men." That sentence summarized the new reality. The Luftwaffe had not merely lost planes, it had lost possession of the atmosphere. The American perspective back in England, The bomber crews received intelligence summaries with quiet satisfaction. Reconnaissance confirmed that H2X bombing had achieved the same damage ratio as visual attacks, at a fraction of the losses. The new doctrine solidified overnight. Every group would have its own radar pathfinder, and weather would never again halt an operation. At mission briefings, the tone shifted. Mickey-equipped now meant unstoppable. Airmen joked that Mickey doesn't care about the forecast. But underneath the humor was awe, and a strange unease. They were now waging a war where death came from echoes, where they no longer looked their enemy in the eye. The technology that saved them from blindness also detached them from what they destroyed. Psychological aftershocks. For the defenders, the psychological effect was devastating. The idea of unseen bombardment, of annihilation arriving through overcast, broke something deeper than morale. It fractured faith in any predictable defense. Soldiers manning flak towers described the first sensation not as fear, but disbelief. The earth exploded, but the sky was empty, one wrote in a post-war memoir. Civilians began to joke darkly. When clouds come, death follows. Even Adolf Galland, former general of fighters, later admitted, "Our defense system was designed for an age when visibility governed battle. Once the Americans no longer required visibility, our system had no meaning." From tactical edge to strategic certainty after Magdeburg, the 8th Air Force scheduled raids without regard for weather. H2X ships led every group. Even when the equipment malfunctioned, crews flew blind Mickey missions, estimating from radar shadows. Accuracy varied, but persistence crushed any remaining German recovery. Factories hidden under camouflage nets were still hit because radar saw structure, not color. Ports blanketed in fog were destroyed because radar saw shape, not light. And every time a city vanished under clouds, the lesson deepened. Technology had conquered nature itself. By spring 1945, German radar operators no longer bothered to report cloud cover to higher command. Weather had lost its meaning. The last illusion of safety, the idea that the heavens could hide you, was gone. The aftermath of that realization reshaped not just tactics but the very philosophy of war. The next generation of weapons would not rely on sunlight, sightlines, or even human eyes. They would rely on reflection, frequency, and calculation, when weather stopped being an excuse. The war did not end, the day clouds lost their power, but the nature of air warfare did. After Magdeburg and the winter radar raids of 1945, a new understanding crystallized inside Allied headquarters. Visibility was no longer a requirement for destruction. From experiment to standard procedure. Before the H2X Mickey came along, the 8th Air Force's operational calendar had followed the weather maps. Crews studied fronts and ceiling forecasts like scripture. Now, the daily meteorological briefings were reduced to logistics. Icing layers, fuel consumption, turbulence. Target selection no longer waited for sunlight. By February 1945, nearly every heavy bomber group possessed its own radar-equipped Pathfinder aircraft. These flew in the lead position, guiding entire wings to targets through overcast and fog. The phrase Mickey Lead became standard shorthand in mission orders. Bombing through cloud was no longer innovation. It was expectation. The results spoke in tonnage. Between January and April 1945, the 8th Air Force dropped over 160,000 tons of bombs under full or partial overcast. In previous winters, such conditions had cut sortie rates in half. Accuracy analysis revealed something astonishing. The radar-guided average miss distance, the radius within which half the bombs fell, was only 20 to 25% worse than visual bombing. For strategic warfare, where targets were cities, refineries, and marshalling yards, that difference was irrelevant. The Americans had achieved something long thought impossible: a 24-hour, all-weather bombing capability. Data from the wreckage post-strike reconnaissance confirmed the transformation. Even through smog and snow, photo interpreters found the telltale geometry of H2X bombing. regular spacing, clustered impacts along railway lines and factory roofs, minimal overshoot. The technique had its limits. Pinpoint strikes on bridges or small depots still required clear skies, but for industrial targets, radar was decisive. When analysts compared the results of the January Magdeburg and March Brunswick missions, they found nearly identical efficiency despite one being conducted in full cloud and the other in clear weather. The conclusion, circulated in an April report from the 8th Air Force's Operations Analysis Section, was understated but historic. H2X application has removed the principal, meteorological constraint upon sustained bombing operations over the continent, translated into plain speech. Clouds had stopped mattering. 4. The German war economy, this change was fatal. The Allied offensive no longer paused for storms. Synthetic fuel plants that once used bad weather for repair work found no respite. Transport networks could not rebuild because bridges and yards were struck again before the smoke cleared. The rhythm of war became relentless. Destruction without interruption. German reports from the Reich Ministry of Armaments grew desperate. One noted that by March 1945, no effective production recovery can occur. American operations are continuous regardless of weather. Even Albert Speer, in post-war testimony, admitted that radar bombing completed the paralysis begun by our fuel shortages. Training and doctrine as radar bombing proved itself. Training pipelines adapted overnight. The U.S. Army Air Forces opened Radar School No. 3 in February 1945 at Alconbury, and another in France, turning out dozens of operators per week. Instruction combined radar interpretation with map correlation, timing, and interphone discipline. Crews learned to fly entire sorties without a single external visual cue, an experience both liberating and unnerving. For commanders, the new doctrine also created a dilemma. Who now owned precision? The bombardier had once been the moral center of the crew, the man who aimed. With Mickey, aim had migrated to the machine and the operator who interpreted it. This shift foreshadowed a deeper transformation in warfare, one that would, over time, move decision-making from human sight to instrumental display. The German debriefs after the war, Allied technical intelligence units, the USAAF, air disarmament teams, interrogated captured Luftwaffe radar officers. Their notes painted a picture of disbelief. Most German crews first heard of radar bombing not from science journals or captured equipment, but from watching cities explode in the rain. One commander summarized the helplessness bluntly. "We used to thank the weather. Then we began to fear it." The Luftwaffe's final monthly operational summary in April 1945 admitted that enemy attacks occur in all conditions. Our fighters cannot locate them. Our flak cannot predict them. It was the obituary of their entire defensive system. From the ruins to the laboratory, the lessons learned from Mickey did not vanish with victory. Engineers from the MIT Radiation Laboratory and British TRE quickly began adapting radar bombing for peacetime mapping and for future weapons guidance. The same principles: ground return mapping, signal contrast, pulse timing, became the foundation for the next generation of navigation systems. LORAN, SHORAN, and eventually the all-weather bombing radars of the Cold War, like AN, APQ-13, and AN, APQ-7, Eagle. Every one of those systems carried within it the DNA of Mickey, the conviction that you did not need to see to hit. By war's end, the radar operators had turned the invisible into routine. They had made weather obsolete, daylight optional, and precision independent of the human eye. Yet, beneath the triumph, a quieter question lingered. What happens to the meaning of warfare when man no longer sees what he destroys? Echoes that never faded, from Mickey to the age of missiles. When the guns fell silent in 1945, much of the world thought the new age would be one of peace. In the laboratories of Massachusetts, Dayton, and Farnborough, another truth took shape. The invisible eye that had guided bombs through clouds would never close again. From bombers to circuits at the MIT Radiation Laboratory, engineers who had spent the war refining radar bombardment began to ask, if radar could find a city, could it also guide a bomb? Their answer came quickly. In 1946, prototypes appeared. Radio command and beam-riding systems built directly on H2X principles. One engineer put it bluntly, "We've taught the aircraft to see. Now we'll teach the bomb to think." This was the birth of the standoff concept. Release a weapon far from danger and let electronics finish the job. The AN/APQ-7 Eagle radar system, a direct descendant of Mickey, soon gave bombers like the B-29 full terrain mapping capability. Within a decade, that same logic would produce navigational bombing computers, terrain-following radar, and eventually the cruise missile. Mickey had shown that precision was a question of signal, not sunlight. The weapon designers of the Cold War took that lesson and never let it go. Doctrines without weather, when the U.S. Air Force was born in 1947, one of its first strategic memoranda declared, "Future air power must be independent of weather, light, and distance." It was a simple sentence, but it rewrote how the military thought about the sky. Every radar-guided system that followed, from Korean War, Choran strikes to Vietnam's combat sky spot, traced its lineage to the green glow inside those 1945 bombers. The doctrine of all-weather attack soon became global. Soviet planners copied the idea through their own radar navigation systems like Rubin and Kurs-MP, ensuring their heavy bombers could find American cities in any season. NATO adopted radar bombing as a baseline skill. Training manuals described Mickey techniques decades after the original sets were scrapped. The human cost of distance, but the same device that freed airmen from clouds also distanced them from consequence. When B-29 crews in the Pacific used H2X for night radar raids on Tokyo, they struck from 30,000 feet into invisibility. No city lights, no visible firestorms, just blips and coordinates. Veterans later admitted that it felt more like operating machinery than fighting. One recalled, "We watched the scope, called the drop, and a few minutes later the whole screen flickered from the heat. We knew what that meant, but we didn't see it." Maybe that was the point. The moral geometry of air war had changed. Sight, that fragile thread connecting action and empathy, had been severed by technology. From then on, every advancement in bombing would deepen that separation. H2X was the first true step toward remote war. Germany's post-war lesson. For post-war German engineers, Mickey's arrival had been an unwanted tutorial. In Allied debriefs, captured radar experts spoke with grim respect. "They took away our weather," one said, "and with it, the rhythm of the war." He meant more than meteorology. He meant the psychological cadence, the pauses for storms, the relief between raids. Mickey ended that rhythm. Destruction became continuous, detached, and systemic. The world's first data-driven war had begun. Legacy of the green screen. By the early 1950s, every major air force had a radar mapping capability. The U.S. Strategic Air Command's B-36 and B-47 crews practiced blind bombing runs across the Arctic. The British V-bombers used their own H2S Mark IX derived from the same wartime technology. Even civilian aviation adopted radar mapping for transoceanic navigation. The old Mickey domes, once secret, sat in scrapyards or museums. Plexiglass bubbles that had once peered through entire weather systems. To most visitors they looked crude, even quaint. But for those who had served in them, that dull green glow was unforgettable. It had been the color of confidence and sometimes of guilt. A shift in the meaning of precision. Precision had once meant skill, a bombardier's steady hand and practiced judgment. After Mickey, it meant resolution, the clarity of a signal. From there, it became programming, and later, algorithm. The line from that radar scope led straight to guided bombs, drones, and satellites, each a further abstraction of aim, each removing one more layer of human fallibility, and human feeling. The operators of 1945 could never have imagined how far their invention would reach, but they had already glimpsed its essence. "When we hit Magdeburg through 10/10ths cloud," one veteran said, "we realized the future didn't need eyes, only instruments." End of an era, beginning of another. When historians later traced the fall of the Luftwaffe's defense, they pointed not only to lost pilots or fuel shortages, but to the day clouds stopped mattering. The Mickey raids were quiet revolutions. The moment when war left the visible world and entered the electronic, what began as a desperate workaround for weather became the blueprint for half a century of strategic thought. The sky had become transparent, and nothing below it would ever be invisible again. The clouds had always been part of the war, the last refuge of men who could not outfight the sky. When the weather thickened, both sides rested, believing nature itself had called a truce. But in the winter of 1945, that truce ended. The invention that pierced the clouds also pierced illusion. The H2X Mickey radar did not roar or blaze. It simply revealed. It taught the airmen that light was no longer necessary, that the world could be measured by echoes alone. Inside those dim compartments, the war became something colder, a series of pulses, ranges, and coordinates. The human eye, that ancient witness of battle, was replaced by a beam, and yet, for those who sat at the screens, the emotion never truly left. The radar operator who called "target confirmed" might never see the fire his words unleashed, but he felt its weight all the same. Many wrote afterward of strange dreams, of glowing circles, of rivers made of light, of bombs falling through endless fog. The conscience lingers even when the eyes are closed. In the decades that followed, nations built missiles that guided themselves by radar shadows, aircraft that could navigate continents without a single landmark, and drones that see without pilots. The lineage runs straight back to that quiet hum under the belly of a liberator. The device that ended blindness also began distance, the separation between decision and destruction. Magdeburg, Brunswick, Hanover. Their ruins became more than targets struck. They became symbols of what happens when science erases the limits that once defined mercy. The green glow of Mickey was a new dawn for warfare, but it was also a sunset for the age when men looked upon what they destroyed. The clouds still drift over Europe. They are the same clouds that once hid hope and horror alike. But no one who knows that history can ever look at them the same way again. For above them, once, flew men who proved that nothing, not even the sky itself, could hide the world from its own reflection.